Thanks, Laura. Well, if you've ever wondered how far God will go to reach you, my next guest has a story that will inspire, no doubt. Craig Forbes is the Evangelism and Outreach Pastor at Lakemount Worship Centre, just down the road here from us. And I'm so glad to have him here today to share his journey to faith. Welcome to 100 Huntley Street, Craig.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
It's so good to have you. As I mentioned off the top of the show, your story is full of themes of abandonment, redemption, transformation, you know, God bringing a sense of validation into your life when perhaps you didn't feel like it was worth it. Mm-hmm. And we're going to take your story maybe a little bit out of order, but I do want to start at the beginning, at least at this point in the interview. You were born in Jamaica.
Yes.
But you sitting here today is a miracle because you almost didn't make it out of the womb.
Yeah, I don't remember everything because
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So my mother's father was a very prominent preacher, pastor, Worldwide Church of God, very well known throughout the West Indies and even in the United States.
Right.
And so at the age of 19, my mother became pregnant with me, but out of wedlock.
Okay.
And that obviously made him very upset and embarrassed him. And to the point, he was a very strict disciplinarian, and
Yes.
The outcome wasn't that good.
Right.
I heard that he disciplined my mother, and there was concerns that I might not have survived the pregnancy.
Right.
Yeah.
But by the grace of God, you did.
By God's grace, I'm here today.
Yes, and just, you know, to qualify, there certainly has been, you know, a history of maybe excessive discipline, and you know, in any number of faith groups, it's just been a part of history. We have come a long way in terms of how much that is played out nowadays. But you know, unpack for us a little bit what life was like for you growing up in Jamaica as a young boy. I mean, because further on in the story, your mom comes to Canada ahead of you to get things set up for you and your sister to join her. But what was life like for young Craig in Jamaica?
So as far back as I can remember, my first 4 years, I was raised by my grandparents,
Okay.
my father's parents.
Okay.
And I don't remember much. I just have flash memories of my great-grandmother and other things. I remember my uncle coming to visit me. And I remember at the age of 4, my uncle, great uncle of mine, came to pick me up and bring me to Kingston to be with my mother.
Okay.
And so that was, I think, the first time that I remember being with my mother. And I was with her for 2 years.
Yeah. I think it's amazing and really a compliment to tradition like the Jamaican cultural norms for the whole family to take care of children. It really does take a village, and they take that very seriously.
Yes.
And everyone steps in and helps and provides support. In the case of your mother, she was a single mom. She was a teenage mom. So you were living with your grandparents, your father's parents,
Yes.
but you didn't have a relationship with your dad. How do you think that affected you, Craig, you know, without that lack of connection to him?
You know, at that age, it didn't really ponder on me. I didn't even think about it. It was just, to me, that was just the norm. Mm-hmm. But I do remember when my mother was about to leave to go to Canada, to come to Canada, that she took me to see my father. And it was for the first time I was going to meet him. I might have met him before, but I didn't remember.
Right.
And by the time we were on our way up the front steps of where he worked, he was already on the back door, out the back doors. And that's the only time I remember anything about my dad. And yeah, that rejection was there.
Right.
You know?
From a young age. I'm sure many are saying, you know, surely Craig had a meaningful, close relationship with your mother in the absence of your dad. But, you know, that was, you know, sometimes the case, not necessarily always the case. As you mentioned, your mom immigrated to Canada in search of a better life for you, I'm assuming. How did you handle that, you know? How did you emotionally compartmentalize that, I suppose? Because as you get older, you start to realize that maybe my mom's not around as much. Yeah. What does a youngster do to process that?
So my aunt and uncle in Jamaica, they're excellent people. My uncle is a police officer, and so they raised myself and my sister for the 3 years that my mother left us in Jamaica. And life was very good. I really enjoyed being with them. I know my mother would send us things from time to time, but that point of reference and that strong relationship, I didn't feel that at the time. So when it was time for us to come to Canada, it was very confusing because I didn't want to leave Jamaica. I didn't want to leave my aunt and uncle, but I also knew that I needed to be with my mother. So it was a time of confusion. And when we came here, I struggled with, how do I say mom? Like, there was a lot of things that I struggled with and how to navigate being with my mother for the first time.
Right.
You know?
Did things improve for you and your sister once you moved to Canada? Because that was the ultimate goal, right? To create a better life for you. Because your mom came ahead of you, set things up, sent for you.
Yeah.
You and your sister came to Canada, to the Toronto area, I understand.
Yes.
What was life like for you then? Because I understand she got into a relationship shortly after you came to Canada.
Yeah, things were good. My mother was a hard-working woman. You know, she made sure that my sister and I were well taken care of. And shortly after, maybe a couple of years after, she met a gentleman and she married him, became my stepfather. Okay. And so we started to live a very normal life. We grew up in Pickering, Ontario.
Great
town.
Very well. I used to live there myself.
Yeah, Pickering was a great town, and life was going great, you know, like involved in sports and everything else. My mother was an amazing mother. My stepfather, so much, I mean, he was a provider, but he really wasn't there. So as far as having that father figure, it wasn't what you would expect in a father.
Right.
You know, he was there present, but absent in areas that he should have been.
So you live in the context of this family. Your mom is a hard worker, caring, providing for you and your sister. You grew up and become somewhat of a teenage, early 20-year-old, a little bit reckless in your living, started kind of living life by your own standards, according to your own script.
Yeah.
What happened to you that would cause you to reorientate your life in the direction of faith in Christ?
Wow. So
I mean, I know we're skipping because your story has so many elements, Craig. But I want to get to that point where you really made this decision to follow Jesus, because it was transformative for you.
So I buried myself in sports, and I found out that I was really good in sports. And so I played baseball. I was a captain of my high school wrestling team. I was on the Scarborough Wrestling Club. I also wrestled for the Ontario wrestling team.
Amazing.
And things were going great. And in my last year of high school, my mother and my stepfather, they split up because, you know, of infidelity. And so it was a very hard time for my mother, and I had two sisters at this time. Okay. And we found ourselves in a very bad position where we were like basically almost homeless. And so my mother thought that the best option was for me to go to New York to be with my grandparents. And she went elsewhere with my other two sisters. And so when I moved to New York, I heard that it was to be with my grandparents again, who I haven't seen forever. And I heard that my father was living there. And there was so much excitement in me to get to know my real father. I've always envisioned what my father would look like. You know, growing up as kids, we used to watch The Love Boat. Yeah. Do you remember the bartender, Isaac? That my whole time, that's what I envisioned my father to look like. And, you know, I get to my grandparents' house, and everybody's welcoming me, my family. Yes. And I hear that my father is on his way through the door. So I'm very excited to see him. And he walked through the door. He looked nothing like I thought he would look. And somebody said, "This is your son, Craig." They call me Leighton. And the first things that he said to me was, "I don't owe you anything." And it just crushed me because I didn't go to receive anything. I didn't go for any other reason than I didn't have a choice. And I was so excited to meet my father, and those words just hit me like a hammer. And so I navigated through that and tried to build a relationship the best that I could, but it was very difficult. My father was an alcoholic. My grandmother was a very strong believer. And to see the way that he treated her, he was just very verbally abusive and would just cower over her and speak to her in ways that just made me feel disgusted. So I really did not have much respect for my dad. And I became very angry. You know, it just felt like life was going great, and then my life was just turned upside down. And it was like, what's happening to me? And so I just got to the point where I just didn't care anymore. And then was with my grandparents in New York for a while. And then things started to get difficult for them. And they were saying, you know, you have so many needs that can't be met by us. Somebody has to take care of you. And it was just very difficult for them. A short while later, I heard that my mother and my sisters came back to Canada, and they were living in Toronto. So I decided to come back to be with them and to help take care of my mother.
Right.
Yeah.
So you come back to Toronto, and to try to cover off on some of the main points of your story, you start working, you're supporting yourself, you get in, you build somewhat of a life that is got everything that you need. You know, you had your needs met materially, emotionally, you were in a relationship that was meaningful to you, but there was something missing. What was that?
Wow. So when I came back to Canada, we ended up living in Ontario housing. And it wasn't the lifestyle that I was used to. It was a whole new world. I found myself surrounded by drug dealers and pimps and prostitutes, and that became my circle of friends. And my life just became so reckless, and I just got involved in many things. Some things I didn't, and I look back later and I see that it was God that prevented me from doing that. But I was working, I was just going through life and doing what I thought was best, without any point of reference on how my father demonstrated to me, or like modeled to me. I just tried to figure things out on my own. I went through numerous relationships, and at one point I got a girl pregnant, and she was pregnant with my firstborn son, and I just felt the right thing to do was to live together and just try to build a life together. But I was doing all of this in my own strength, my own wisdom, just trying to figure it out. It was very rough, but we stayed together for a while, and then we had a second child. And then as time went on, things were just not going good, so we went our separate ways. Short time after, I got full custody of my kids, and I was just raising them on my own. Yeah.
And to pick up the story from there, you are now a single dad. You've got full custody of your kids. What was the catalyst that you'd felt this sort of this nagging draw to come to church? You know, you would go and you would kind of attend, but you hadn't really embraced the faith. What was the catalyst that caused you to say yes to Jesus, that brought you into that relationship that would change everything, including, this whole level of forgiveness that you were able to extend to other family members that you didn't think was even possible?
Wow. So hopefully I'm not going off script here.
No, that's okay.
But when my son was born, I started to look at life differently. And I just started to say, you know what, I have to provide for my son. One thing I determined in my heart growing up, that my children would never grow up without a father. They would never have to experience the things that I experienced. And so I was devoted, I was committed to being a good father to my children. So because of that, I improved myself and applied at the Toronto Transit Commission, and I got a job as a bus driver.
Okay.
And so things were going well there. I met a beautiful woman that was also a single mother, and we came together. And so now we're raising a family. She didn't have a point of reference as a mother because her mother died when she was very young. And I didn't have a point of reference as a father. So we're just trying to figure everything out on our own. And if it wasn't for Christ, I don't know if we'd still be together. But we realized that there has to be more than this. And so we started trying to visit different churches. We visited Anglican Church, the United Church, but we just didn't feel that it was meeting our needs. And so we kind of gave up on church for a while. But then I started feeling this draw within inside of me. You got to go to church, you got to go to church. And I resisted it. And I was experiencing a lot of health issues as well. When I was newly married, I was having ulcers, and I was so sick I'd end up in the hospital, and they were running tests, but they couldn't find anything wrong with me. I was having blackouts while I was driving the bus. And and just even memories of things from the past, like the lifestyle that I used to live, just used to torment me. And I started to say, there's got to be more to life than this. And so I used to, on a daily basis, pick up the newspaper and open it up, right straight to the Sunshine Girl, and then flip through the rest. But then as I started to say, there's got to be more to life than this, I remembered that prior to my wife, I was living with a girl. And when she moved out, she took everything, but she forgot this little red Bible.
And you have it with you today.
This little red Gideon's Bible saved my life. So instead of reading the newspaper, I started to read this. And the more that I read, the more truth of God's word that just became revealed to me. I grew up in a very religious environment, and a lot of things that I used to hear, I always questioned. And I just doubted many things, but as I started to read God's word, his truth just became alive.
Yeah.
And so we started going to church. And I remember putting on my beautiful pinstripe suit and going to church and lifting my hands and clapping and doing everything else. And as a believer would do, but I wasn't a believer. And I remember the drummer the whole time was just watching me. And at the end of the service, he came down and he says, "Are you a believer?" And I said to him, "I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but there's some things in my life that I need to clean up first before I come to Jesus."
Yeah.
And he looked me as bluntly as he could, and he says, "If you need to clean up your life before coming to Jesus, you will never come to him. But if you give your life to him, he will clean it up."
Yeah.
And those words just never left me.
Craig, there's, as I mentioned, there's so many elements to your story that I'd love to get into, and we have run out of time.
I'm sorry.
I love that. I love right there, because you made, in that season of life, you made that decision to follow Christ and
Yes.
to give it over to him.
Yes.
And just to bring a little bit of closure to your story for our viewers, you had this opportunity, beautiful opportunity, to minister to your dad when he was passing away, and to minister forgiveness to him and to pray with him. And I think that's an amazing testimony to what God did in your life, because God came in, did a miraculous work in your life. And now you're serving him in the area of evangelism and outreach down at Lakemount. And we're going to have you back at some point to tell the rest of your story and what God has done in and through you. But thank you so much for being with us here today. And just to our viewers, the vulnerability and the honesty of a guy like Craig doesn't come easy to be able to talk about our past. But you know what? The reality is that from his story, you can pull the truth of God's plans and promises for your life today, and you simply have to surrender. And that drummer that said to you that day, if you ever feel like you got to clean up your life enough for God to meet you, you'll never do it. He comes into your mess and makes beauty out of the ashes of our lives. Thank you for being with us here today, Greg. Greg, God bless you, and stay with us. There's more to come.